Good morning. My name is Suzanne McAllister of Interviews with a Friendly Vegan, the Post Animal Use Project, or PAW, P-A-U-W Project, and Vegan Spirituality Group of Philadelphia. And today I'm really happy to be interviewing Max Broad of DC Voters for Animals, who I met recently on a webinar. And I believe the way we were connected was through a meditation link. So thank you, Max, for making time this morning. I really appreciate it. And my first question is, tell me how you got the idea to start, or just tell us about DC Voters for Animals that you started, I believe, in 2019.
Yeah, the whole idea behind DC Voters for Animals is lifting up the policies and politicians doing the most for animals, whether it's companion animals like dogs and cats, animals in farms or labs, or wildlife. So we're Big Tent, focusing on political advocacy for all animals. The whole idea behind it is, the notion of people power in the political process. We can make such a big impact when we are raising our voices and engaged in the democratic process. So the vision is to get vegans, animal lovers, animal rights people, have our interests reflected in the political process, because otherwise, if we're not speaking up, the decisions are all going to be made by people who are entrenched in the status quo. And as you and I know, the status quo has driven a lot of harm for animals.
No question. And one of the things that I thought about when I was just making notes and reflecting on what I wanted to talk about with you this morning is that it is so easy to get distracted by the national discourse, which is basically what gets covered on the news. And I think it's also very easy to feel overwhelmed, like, how can I, one person or one small organization, have an impact when the money that's in politics and the entrenchment of the folks who are there decade after decade after decade, and who are basically in cahoots with the lobbyists and really don't want to do anything to change what's going on. And I read a book a couple of years ago by political science professor Eitan Hersh called Politics is Power. And I've actually given it to a few of the people who I'm connected with in my community. And his whole thesis, or at least what I took away from it, was if you really want to make a change, don't go to the top. Don't go even to your federal representatives. Start at your school board. Start at your city council. And he gave some very, very compelling examples. So I was thinking about that in terms of the DC Voters for Animals, where you are starting in a smaller jurisdiction. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I also am a big fan of Eitan Hersh, and the notion that we can make a difference by coalescing on the local level. And that's really what inspired me. And in particular, it was a vision from Direct Action Everywhere,
Okay.
that stated that, hey, if we work together on local levels normalizing animal protection laws, then that can normalize it for the people in those jurisdictions. And if we spread that across the country, that can help us level up to the state and federal level. So, I really believe in that. And I just think that, our voice is so important in the political process. And the way I frame the issue is looking at, you have two sides. You have the market side and you have the political side when you're trying to advance an animal protection message. And the market side is really advancing quickly. Look at the dairy sales that have, or non-dairy sales that have happened over the past decade, right? We've seen explosions of non-dairy milks, and non-vegans are drinking oat milk, almond milk, you know, just without hesitation. So we've seen that market explode. But on the flip side, over the past decade, we've also seen an increase in the number of cows in the U.S. dairy herd. So what does that mean? You know, less people are drinking dairy, but more cows are being grown and bred into a life of cruelty.
Yes.
And so what does that say? To me, what it says is that there are systemic incentives for farmers to grow cows, to produce cows. And
Yeah,
we need to find interventions to those incentives. And
I
I
mean,
think doing so politically is the best way to do it.
it has always struck me that we as taxpayers are paying for these farm subsidies. And I'm wondering, I didn't know that what you just said. I knew that there was an explosion in the non-dairy milk market, but I didn't know that more and more cows were actually being bred as dairy cows, which, like you said, makes no sense whatsoever. What's happening with those cows? What are they doing with them if they don't need the milk? So I suspect it's almost always follow the money. And the same thing with experiments on animals, where they get funding year after year after year to replicate a study that really has almost no bearing on anything, but they need to get the grant so that they can continue to have a job and employ their techs. So I'm curious, when you're working on a project, and maybe you can tell us about a project that you feel particularly good about, whether or not you also are interfacing with other municipalities where you're sharing information. But maybe first tell me about a project that you worked on that you feel good about.
Yeah, happy to. And I just want to point out a real frustration of mine is, in terms of your comment about follow the money, is that a lot of the subsidized milk gets dumped on our schools.
Yes.
So there's shipping it to school children and marketing it as something that's healthy. And the thing that's really frustration is the disproportionate impact this has on students of color who are minority or majority lactose intolerant, whether it's Black and African American, whether it's Asian, whether it's Native American, where just rampant lactose intolerance rates. But the government is instead using this as an opportunity to bail out the struggling dairy industry, which is just it's a lose-lose for everybody except for a few huge farmers.
Exactly. And I'm wondering, you having mentioned that, and I interviewed a woman who has an organization, a nonprofit in my area called One More Meal. And she is trying to educate the schools in our area about alternatives to milk and offering students vegan lunches. But you're right, the preponderance of the kids who are dependent on the school breakfast or lunch are minority students who are poorer. So yes, they are the ones that are going to be drinking it, eating cheese, whatever, and getting sick in the process.
And it's great that schools are starting to offer options, but I just learned that schools have to require dairy milk. It has to be the default.
Right.
And I don't know about other jurisdictions. I presume it's the same because in DC, they're federally required that dairy milk is the default, and then students can get a waiver to drink alternatives, but they have to like fax in this waiver, go through this long bureaucratic process. It's quite daunting.
Yes, well, and those are the kinds of things we hear, and then we say, oh my gosh, how can I fight against it? And yet I think what you're saying with your organization and what this woman with One More Meal, and I know there are plenty of others like it, who are really trying to get schools to push back on that and say, no, we don't want that to be the default. So,
Yeah, exactly. And it feels totally overwhelming, right? Like, how do I get the federal government to stop, with these crazy systems and subsidies? But you got back to a point of earlier about the importance of local level action, and indeed we can see wins. And our first big win in DC was around a bill that had been languishing for years. It was introduced in 2015 to ban the sale of ivory and rhino horn, and it kept failing. It died in that council session, was reintroduced in 2017, again failed, died in committee, reintroduced in 2019. And people were like, why does this bill keep failing? Like, who's opposing it?
yes,
And the answer was nobody. There was no opposition to it.
that's crazy.
The council just didn't consider it a priority. So, when we started in 2019, we brought together a coalition of organizations. We built a presence of pressure on social media, and we did direct lobby meetings to finally get this bill through the finish line. And now it's been signed into law.
Wow. I mean, that's really a cautionary tale. I'm thinking, so do you go to is it city council? So do you go to those meetings just to hear what issues are being raised, or do you present to them? Tell me how that works, your relationship with city council.
Yeah, great question. There's a great book by Julie Lewin about how to get involved in the political process for animals.
How do you
And
spell the last name?
Julie
Lewin?
Lewin, Lewin, I believe.
Okay.
And a big thesis of the book is like a lot of action happens just by being around the halls of the decision makers, and pop-in meetings and catching people as they're walking from office to office. And of course, during COVID, things have been different. But finding ways to increase our exchange, but not just that. It's concentrating the movement, right? Getting people who care about these issues to direct their energy in useful ways and in targeted ways, because you and I know we only have so much energy, and as much as we care, we only have so much time in the day. So getting a bunch of us to act as a voting bloc, to weigh in on legislation, whether that's contacting our elected officials or testifying at a hearing, those things really, really matter.
So how do you go about, well, I guess maybe two questions. One is, do you look at bills that have been proposed, like with the ban of ivory, or do you actually try to initiate a bill, or do you do both?
So right now we're working on our first big start to finish campaign, which would be to ban fur in DC.
Okay.
And big reason why we like it is because we've seen it already pass in about, I think, 8 other jurisdictions across the country. And we want to see that grow to include the nation's capital. And what we saw happen in California that was really cool was it was banned in West Hollywood, then San Francisco and Berkeley, and then the entire state banned new sales of fur. So it just goes to show that we can grow as a movement.
That's great. And you mentioned earlier that you work in collaboration with other organizations. So when you say come up with your next project to ban fur, are you working with other local organizations? Explain to us the process you go through. That would be helpful.
Great question. So a lot of it is community input locally, right? What are our priorities? And just knowing that there's not going to be buy-in from the community if the community leaders aren't part of the process from the get-go.
Okay.
So that was really important to us. But yeah, we also work with great national level organizations. The folks at HSUS have been really tremendous in terms of offering legal and strategic policy advice.
Okay.
And then also knowing what's happening at the local level organizations. And I'm really excited that the Humane League recently hired a national policy director to focus on getting some of the local level organizations better coordinated as we try and concentrate our efforts across the country.
That's fabulous. So they now have somebody whose job is going to be to see what's happening on the local level and get them coordinated with each other. Is that?
Yep, coordinated and empowered, right? Giving us all the skills, the tools to make a real difference.
That's great. I mean, I know I attended a lobbying day in Harrisburg, which is our state capital, with HSUS a number of years ago. So I know they have a state rep. But I'm the effort on the really local level is what I'm interested in. So if I'm hearing you right, I need to start attending the council meetings in my little local jurisdiction. I just moved to this particular town in March. But I know that it's a borough, and there's this what's called the borough council, I guess. So attending those, getting to know the mayor, my state rep, I know to say hello to him, and I go to his office when I need something, and he's very responsive. He's new, so he's, I think, really wanting to have a good impact in his first year. So he was voted in 2020. So he's been in office a little over a year. And I also know my federal rep. In fact, when I think somebody mentioned, I can't remember whether it was you or your colleague, Parveen, was that his name?
Praveen, yeah.
Praveen. Susan Wild, who is a Pennsylvania representative who gets very high marks. And I actually went on her website and I made a donation to her campaign and said, I want you to know that I learned that you were a big advocate for animals. That's why I'm making a donation, even though you're not in my district. And could you please talk to Madeline Dean and make sure that she's on the same page with you? So I figure they're in touch with each other, but I can now reach out to Madeline Dean and say, this is what your colleague Susan Wild is doing. Where are you on this? So finding the ways to communicate with these folks to let them know you're paying attention is at least one thought I have.
Well, I'm so glad that you've had positive experiences with your politicians. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, yeah, their doors are open. Like, you can walk in, you can give their staff a call anytime, right?
Yes.
You can call their office and say, hey, will you pay attention to these animal issues? It's great.
Well, and that's the step I haven't taken yet. You would think I would have taken that step. I mean, I volunteered during the 2020 presidential campaign, so I did stuff on absentee ballots and so on. And I met the guy who has become my representative, Napoleon Nelson's right-hand person. So I have a personal relationship with him, which helps when you walk in and they know that you put your money where your mouth is, you're active, you do things. But I haven't yet gone in to talk about animal issues, mainly because, so you gave me a good example, the ivory trade and the fur ban. So I guess it's choosing an issue that seems to me necessary. If you just say I'm an animal advocate, they don't know what to do with that, I don't think.
Right.
So is that how you go about it? You look for something that you know is on their radar screen, or that could be, I guess maybe just I'm going to ask you, how do you choose an issue? You already mentioned with the ivory trade, but say with the fur ban.
Yeah, it's a great question. And a lot of it is up to the hands of the politicians because they're the decision makers. So all we can do is either appeal to their interests or pressure them into doing something. And, our shtick is not doing pressure campaigns. We really like to be collaborative.
Yes.
And so, finding politicians who have an interest in one of our issues. And, the way we did that was when the elections happened in 2020, we sent out candidate questionnaires and said, hey, where do you stand on these different animal issues?
Okay.
And got to see where candidates, really aligned with us. And, for some, the fur issue really popped out.
That is a great idea. So you designed a questionnaire and then you brought it to the candidates and you asked them to fill it out.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd love to see an example of that. Is that on your website?
It's all on our website. And, it's good for not only getting it on the politicians' radar, but also so the public knows, how are these candidates, who should I vote for, and how are they relating to animal issues?
Yes, well, and that was something that came up during the webinar that I guess HSUS has a rating scale, is that right? So you
Yeah, for
can look up
Congress.
your Congress people. I imagine they don't go down to the state level.
No, I think that's probably beyond their scope.
Right, unless they're the person who's running their state office. Like we used to have, now I don't know whether they still have that, but I know they did a number of years ago.
They do, and typically the state leaders are very knowledgeable.
That's what I would have thought. So that might be a good place to start. Again, I'm thinking for myself, but also what I'm hoping is that this might spark some interest of people in my community, whether it's Philadelphia or some of the smaller communities surrounding Philadelphia. I don't live in Philadelphia, but outside of Philly, that people might get interested in how do I start to have a relationship with my local rep and start bringing up issues that I care about, and beginning to feel like, you know what, I'm at least having a dialogue so that this person might think differently about it when he or she hears about it from one of their colleagues who's been pressured by their local community. And then it seems like it starts to have some momentum.
Yeah, that's a beautiful vision. And, I think, yeah, it's something that we should all be doing. And like, the good thing is that like, not everybody needs to be Suzanne McAllister. Like, I know who my representatives are. I am in touch, or I know them by name. You don't have to be that person. Like, just being somebody who makes calls every once in a while is great. And like, starting with knowing who your representatives are, that's so key. But
Okay.
also, I would just advocate for outsourcing it as much as people can. Outsourcing the advocacy to organizations like mine. I'll send out alerts when it's time to contact a council member. I'll send out alerts when there's an action where your voice can be really impactful.
So if we don't have something like you, then what would we do? So we need to develop the capacity for an action alert. Is that right?
Absolutely, and I think there's two ways to look at it. On the state and local level, as well as federal, the Humane Society has a wonderful program called Humane Policy Volunteer Leaders.
Okay.
The program's a lot more wonderful than the name is long, but
Humane policy, what was that?
Volunteer leaders.
Okay.
And what they do is, under the direction of HSUS, is guide people in the political process. Very, very cool.
Okay.
So that's a great group. And then working exclusively on the federal level is a group I'm really excited about. Started just a couple of years ago, called Agriculture Fairness Alliance.
Okay.
And they do wonderful lobbying in Congress in very strategic ways, knowing that we're not going to change the influence of big ag in Congress overnight, but we can start to find some win-wins around transitioning farmers who want to get out of animal farming into more sustainable and compassionate forms of farming.
Mm-hmm. Good. So I'm thinking, that I've taken up a lot of your time. I'm wondering, is there anything else that you want to mention to people who are listening to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just very easy to assume that our voice doesn't matter. And indeed, there's nothing that matters more than our voice.
Mm.
When we are not speaking up, we're giving the big corporations that are driving major animal suffering, we're giving them all the ability to make decisions.
Okay.
And so, it's, find ways to get involved, find ways to engage, and show that your voice matters, and channel your passion into a movement for systemic change.
Oh, that's beautifully said. And I really am so glad that I attended the webinar. I met you, that you were willing to take some time out and educate me and the people who will be listening to this about what DC Voters for Animals does. And I just love the model. It seems very, very timely. And like I said, it's been on my mind, do something on the local level, and then here you are. So you're doing it.
It's an exciting thing. So I'm glad that you're thinking about it. I hope others will think about it as well.
Thank you so much. Take care,
Thanks
Matt.
again.
Okay.